The summer Lavinia Ashford turned 29, she finally understood what silence could cost a person. Not the silence of a house at dawn, before the servants stirred and the kitchen fire was lit. That kind of silence she had always found bearable, almost gentle, like a held breath before something good. What she could not bear was the other kind, the kind that lived inside a marriage. The kind that sat across from her at the dinner table every evening, wearing a waistcoat and a distant expression, cutting his meat into precise squares without ever once looking up. His name was Mr. Ashford, Cornelius Ashford, and he was by every outward measure a fine husband. He owned property in the Shenandoah foothills, 400 acres of good Virginia farmland, a mill on the creek, and a house with 14 rooms, 6 of which were never used. He was respected in Berryville. He paid his debts. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble, did not raise his hand to anyone in his household. What he did instead was simply not see her. She had come to him at 22, the daughter of a minister whose health had been failing for 2 years. The arrangement had been practical. Her father's congregation could no longer keep him, and there were 3 younger sisters behind Lavinia, all of whom would need to eat, all of whom would need futures. Cornelius Ashford had land, a good name, and no patience for romantic courtship. He wanted a capable woman who understood the management of a household. Her father wanted his daughters safe. So Lavinia had become Mrs. Ashford on a Tuesday in October. In a ceremony attended by 30 people she barely knew, wearing her mother's altered dress, and carrying a small bouquet of late-season asters that wilted before the afternoon was done. She had not expected love. She had not been foolish enough to expect that, but she had expected something. Courtesy, perhaps. Acknowledgement. The small recognitions that proved a person existed in the eyes of another. A comment at breakfast about the weather. A question about how she had slept. The occasional glance that said, "I see you there." Across this table, in this house, in this life we have built together, 7 years passed without that glance. She learned the rhythms of the Ashford household, the way one learns the rhythms of a foreign country. By observation, by error, by gradual and sometimes painful adjustment. She learned that Cornelius took his coffee without cream, and that he could not abide the smell of lavender, though she bore the name. She learned that he kept his accounts locked in a drawer, and that he preferred to hire men from the same 3 families his father had always hired, whether they were capable or not. She learned that he would answer a direct question if she asked one, but that he would not volunteer information, would not offer opinions unprompted, and would not, under any circumstances, discuss the state of their marriage. She had tried once, in the 3rd year. She had chosen a quiet evening, a fire going, the accounts settled for the week, and she had sat across from him in the parlor and said, plainly, that she sometimes felt as though she were living inside a house where she was invisible. He had looked at her then. Really looked, the way he rarely did, and she had felt a brief, desperate hope. He said, "I don't know what you mean." And he had gone back to his book. She did not try again. Instead, she worked. She managed the household with the kind of competence that went unnoticed, precisely because it never failed. The larder was always stocked. The linens were always pressed. The accounts she was permitted to touch. The household accounts, the kitchen expenses, the wages of the 3 women who worked inside the house. She kept with an accuracy that saved Cornelius, by her own private calculation, somewhere near $40 a year through careful buying and the elimination of waste. He never mentioned it. The farm prospered under his hand, and under the hands of the men he hired, and she knew that prosperity had nothing to do with her. But the house was hers, in every way except in name, in law, in the papers filed at the county courthouse that listed her as dependent and him as owner. She had made peace with that, or she had believed she had. The morning of the day everything changed was an ordinary morning in August. The air was thick and close before 7 o'clock, the kind of heat that arrived before summer had any right to send it. She had been up since 5, because the milk had gone off the evening before, and she wanted to catch it before it found its way to the cheese press. She had sorted the situation, instructed the girl who managed the dairy on the proper rotation, and had come inside to begin the bread before anyone else in the household was awake. She was not resentful of the early hour. She had never minded work. What she minded, what had settled into something low and persistent in her chest over the years, like a stone she had stopped noticing, was the invisibility of it. Cornelius had 2 friends come for dinner that evening, men he did business with, from Charlottesville, a Mr. Denton and a Mr. Fry. She had laid the table herself, arranged the centerpiece herself, supervised the roasting of the 2 chickens that she had selected from the yard 2 days prior, because she knew Cornelius preferred the larger birds in summer. when the heat dulled the appetite, and people ate with their eyes more than their stomachs. She had excused herself after the first course, as was customary. She went to the kitchen to see about the dessert, and then, because the evening was still light and she wanted a moment of air before the long night's work of clearing and washing, she had stepped into the corridor that ran along the side of the house. The dining room window was open. She had not meant to listen. She had stopped to look at the garden, at the way the last light was catching the tops of the cornflowers she had planted along the fence, and she had been thinking about nothing in particular, only about how the garden was the one place she felt something like pleasure in the ordinary course of a day. She had been thinking about that, and she had not registered the voices from the open window until she heard her own name. "Lavinia always does lay a fine table," Mr. Denton said. "You've done well in that respect." There was a pause. "Useful," Cornelius said. The word was light, almost bored. "That's the word for her. Useful," someone laughed. She could not tell which man, or perhaps it was both. "Not the highest praise a man might offer," said Mr. Fry, still smiling in his voice. "No," Cornelius agreed, "but it's an honest one. She keeps the house running and she doesn't ask for much. That's a wife. What more do you want?" Another pause. The clink of a glass set down. "She came highly recommended by her father, which I should have known to take with a grain of salt. What father doesn't recommend his own daughter? But she's been serviceable. I'll say that. Serviceable." Lavinia stood very still in the corridor, her hand pressed flat against the wall. Serviceable. The word for a good pair of boots, for a reliable plow horse, for a tool that had not yet broken. She did not cry. She was surprised by that afterward. Surprised that there were no tears, only a kind of stillness, spreading through her, beginning somewhere in her chest and moving out to her hands and feet. A stillness so complete it felt like something resolving rather than breaking. She thought, 7 years. She thought, I have been here 7 years. She thought, he does not see me at all. He has never seen me at all, and he does not believe he has done anything wrong. She went back to the kitchen. She supervised the dessert. She sent it out with a clean cloth and a steady hand. She sat in the kitchen with her cup of tea and she listened to the sounds of the evening. Laughter from the dining room, the scrape of chairs, the eventual sounds of horses being brought around front as the guests departed. She listened to Cornelius's footsteps cross the hall and go up the stairs. She sat with the cooling tea for a long time. Then she stood up, went to her room, and began to make a list. She had saved $43 over the course of 3 years. Not from any single source, nothing so dramatic as that. A few coins here from the household money when she'd bought cheaper, and the difference was hers to keep by the understanding she'd worked out with the previous housekeeper, before the woman retired. A small sum her mother had pressed into her hand at Christmas, every year without fail, with a look that said, "Put it somewhere safe, girl, and don't tell anyone." A little from the sale of her own embroidery work, sold through Mrs. Price at the dry goods store, who kept a glass case near the door and took a small commission. $43 was not a fortune. She knew that, but it was hers. In a way, nothing else in this house was hers. She packed a single bag. She chose carefully, a change of dress, her warmest shawl, the letters from her mother, the small Bible from her girlhood with her name written inside the cover in her father's handwriting. She took the household ledger she had kept for 7 years, every entry in her own hand, because it was the only proof she had that she had existed here, that she had done anything in this house at all. She did not take her wedding ring. She set it on the nightstand, not thrown, not tucked away, but laid down flat, with deliberateness, the way you set down a thing you have decided you no longer need to carry. She left before the rooster crowed. The road south was empty at that hour. There was a moon, just past full, enough to see by, and the air had dropped 10 degrees from the afternoon's unbearable heat. She walked with her bag across her shoulder, and her eyes on the road, and she did not allow herself to look back at the house. She had gone perhaps 2 miles when she heard the sound of a wagon approaching from behind her. Her first thought, which she would not admit to anyone for a long time, was fear. The road was empty, and it was 4 in the morning, and she was a woman alone, and whatever clarity she had felt standing in the corridor had not, in the dark, entirely banished the awareness of her own vulnerability. She stepped to the side of the road and turned. The wagon slowed. A man was driving, alone, with a load of what appeared to be lumber. He was perhaps 55, with a broad face and a deliberate manner, and he looked at her with the focused attention of someone cataloging a situation before responding to it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. She knew him, vaguely. He was called Silas Price, the husband of the woman who sold her embroidery at the dry goods store. She had spoken to him perhaps 3 times in 7 years. "Mr. Price," she said. He looked at the bag on her shoulder. He looked at the road behind her, empty in the moonlight. He did not ask her any of the questions that were plainly sitting on his tongue. "I'm going as far as Millbury," he said. "If you need a ride." Millbury was 14 miles further south. It was where her mother's sister lived, her Aunt Dorcas, who was a widow, who had a small house, who had written to her twice in the past year with invitations that had the quality of something more than social courtesy. "Come whenever you like," the last letter had said. "Come even if you don't give me notice." "The room is there." "Yes," she said. "Thank you." She climbed up to the seat beside him. He clicked to the horse and they moved on, and neither of them spoke for a long time, which was the right thing, which was exactly what she needed. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, without looking at her, "My wife thinks very highly of your needlework." "She's been very kind," Lavinia said. "She said you could do 6 colors in a single inch and keep them separate." 7, Lavinia said. On a good day, he nodded as though this confirmed something. "There's a woman in Millbury runs a dress shop," he said. "Mrs. Beckwith. She's been looking for an embroiderer for 2 years. Can't find anyone with the patience for fine work." He paused. "I don't know if that's of any use to you." Lavinia looked at the road ahead, pale in the dying moonlight. "It might be," she said. "Yes, it might be exactly that." He said nothing else. She was grateful. Her aunt opened the door at 7 in the morning, took one look at Lavinia's face and said, "Come in. I've got the kettle on." Dorcas Whitfield was 61 years old and had been a widow for 9 years, and had the particular quality of a woman who had been through something genuinely hard and had arrived on the other side of it, with her humor intact and her opinions sharpened. She was small and quick and wore her gray hair in a loose braid that she didn't bother to pin up until noon, and she had in Lavinia's memory never once said anything that she didn't mean. She poured the tea, and she sat across from Lavinia and she said, "How long have you been planning this?" "One night," Lavinia said. "I decided last night." Dorcas considered this. "And before last night?" Lavinia thought about it honestly. 7 years, she said. Her aunt nodded once, as though this made all the sense in the world, and refilled her cup. The days that followed had a quality she had not expected, not the fear she had anticipated, not the grief she thought she might feel, but something stranger and more complicated than either. She woke in the small room her aunt had given her, and she lay still for a few minutes each morning while the knowledge settled over her. You are here, you are not there, you made a choice. And then she got up, because there was work to be done, and work had always been the thing she understood best. She went to see Mrs. Beckwith on the 3rd day. Adeline Beckwith was 44, and ran her dress shop, with the kind of blunt competence that made it immediately clear she had learned everything she knew by necessity, rather than privilege. She had started the shop with her late husband's life insurance payment, and a Singer sewing machine, and in 11 years she had built it into the finest dressmaker's establishment in the county, which in practical terms meant she was always 6 orders behind, and 1 skilled pair of hands short. She sat Lavinia at a table with a piece of ivory silk and a length of thread, and told her to show her what she could do. Lavinia worked for 20 minutes. When she stopped, she laid the piece on the table between them. Mrs. Beckwith studied it without touching it. Then she picked it up, tilted it toward the window, and looked at it for another minute. "What do you need?" she asked. "Steady work," Lavinia said. "Fair wages. I don't need much space. I can work from my aunt's house. I'm organized. I meet deadlines. I won't disappear on you." Mrs. Beckwith looked at her over the top of the silk. Something passed between them that was not quite a question, and not quite an answer, but was understood perfectly by both. "I pay by the piece, Mrs. Beckwith said. The price depends on the complexity and the time. For this," she indicated the sample, "I would pay $1.25. I have 3 orders right now that would require this quality." "How quickly can you work?" Lavinia calculated. 1 piece every 3 days, for work of this intricacy. More for simpler work. Could you do 2 in a week? Some weeks if I needed it? If you gave me the order by Monday. Mrs. Beckwith set the silk down and folded her hands on the table. "I need someone I can rely on," she said plainly. "I've had 3 embroiderers in 2 years. One was reliable but mediocre. One was exceptional but unreliable. I can't have either." "I understand," Lavinia said. "I will be both, reliable and skilled. You have my word." There was a pause, then Mrs. Beckwith said, "I'll start you with 1 order. Proof of concept. For both our sakes." She almost smiled, "though I suspect I already know how this ends." Cornelius came looking for her in the 2nd week. She had half expected it. Not out of love. She knew that now with a clarity that was not bitter so much as plain. But because the house required managing, and he did not know how to manage it, and because she had, she supposed, damaged his reputation in the way that only a wife's departure can damage a man who cares more about standing than about truth, he arrived at her aunt's house on a Wednesday afternoon, in his good coat, and he stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands, and he said that she should come home. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, as though the outcome were already determined, and this was merely a formality, a box to be checked before the world could return to its proper order. Lavinia looked at him from across the room. This man she had lived with for 7 years, whose shirts she had pressed, whose preferences she had catalogued, whose house she had managed with an invisibility so complete that he had been able to sit across a dinner table from 2 friends and call her serviceable with the easy casualness of someone describing a piece of furniture. And she felt, very clearly, nothing that resembled compliance. "No," she said. He blinked. "Lavinia, I heard what you said to Mr. Denton and Mr. Fry," she said. She had decided beforehand that she would not be theatrical about this, and she was not. Her voice was even, her hands were still. "I have no interest in relitigating it. I am simply telling you that I heard it, and I have made a decision, and the decision is mine to make." Cornelius was quiet for a moment. He looked, for the first time in her memory, slightly uncertain. Not remorseful, she noted, but uncertain, which was different, and which said everything. "The house," he said finally, "runs itself," she said. "It doesn't. But it will run well enough for you to hire someone capable. I can recommend several women who need the work and know how to do it." "That's not." He stopped, started again. "What will you do?" "I am already doing it," she said. "I have work. I have a place to live. I have $43 and the beginning of more." He looked at her as though she had said something in a foreign language, as though the existence of a plan was the most surprising part of the entire encounter. More surprising than her leaving, more surprising than her refusal. "You've thought about this," he said. "I have thought about this for 7 years, she said. "I only decided last week." He left without an agreement. He left without the resolution he had come for. She closed the door behind him and stood with her back against it for a moment, feeling something she couldn't entirely name, not triumph, not grief, but something quieter than either. Something more like standing on solid ground and discovering, for the first time, that it was solid. The laws of the state of Virginia in the year 1819 did not make it easy to be a woman without a husband. She knew this. She was not naive. She could not own property in her own name. She could not enter into a contract without a male co-signatory. She could not, in any legal sense, be what she was already becoming. This was the thing that the women who offered her sympathy, and there were several, more than she had expected, sometimes failed to understand. They assumed the hardest part was the leaving. They said how brave, with the emphasis on the bravery of the departure, as though once she was gone the rest would arrange itself. The hardest part was not the leaving. The hardest part was the after. It was Dorcas who first mentioned the land. 3 weeks after Lavinia arrived, her aunt came to her one evening with a box. An old tin box, the kind used for storing papers, with a clasp that had been repaired with wire sometime in the last decade. She set it on the table between them and said, "Your grandmother left you something." "Grandmother Whitfield has been dead for 12 years, 11, Dorcas said. "And yes, she left it in my keeping. She said to give it to you when she judged the time was right." A pause. "She also said she suspected I would know the moment when I saw it." Inside the box were papers, legal papers, signed and witnessed, from 1808. A parcel of land, 31 acres, 4 miles south of Millbury, on the east side of the creek, left to Lavinia Whitfield, as she had been before her marriage, by her maternal grandmother, with the specific provision that the land could not be absorbed into a husband's property without Lavinia's written consent. Her grandmother had found a lawyer clever enough to write the restriction in. Lavinia did not know how. She did not at that moment care. She stared at the papers for a long time. She knew, Lavinia said. She knew what marriages were. "Yes," Dorcas said. "She'd been in one. She wanted you to have something that was yours. 31 acres. Not a fortune. Not a farm exactly, not yet. It had been leased to a neighbor for years, used for hay. Nothing built on it beyond a small stone outbuilding near the creek that the papers described as a storehouse. But it was hers, in her name, in her grandmother's handwriting and a lawyer's steady script. She held the papers and thought about the word serviceable, and the way it had felt to hear it, and she thought about 31 acres on the east side of the creek, and she thought about what a woman could build on 31 acres if she had 7 years of competence behind her and the refusal to be invisible anymore. She saw the land for the first time on a Saturday in September, when the air had finally broken, and there was something that almost resembled autumn in the mornings. Dorcas drove her out in the small cart, and they went slowly because the road was rutted, and when they came over the last rise and the land opened out below them, the fields still golden with old hay, the creek catching the light, the stone outbuilding visible near the water, Lavinia felt something she had no precise name for. Not joy, exactly. More elemental than that. She got down from the cart, and she walked the fence line, and she stood at the edge of the creek and looked at the water, and she thought, this is what I have. This is where I start. She had already been in conversation with Mrs. Beckwith about expanding the embroidery arrangement. She had already done 4 pieces and paid on time, and the quality had been remarked upon by 2 customers who had asked Miss Beckwith for the embroiderer's name. She had also, in the quiet evenings at her aunt's table, begun to write down what she knew about managing a household, about accounts, about the small arithmetic of making a little into enough. She didn't know what she intended to do with the writing. She only knew she had spent 7 years acquiring knowledge that had been treated as nothing, and she was not going to let it stay invisible. It was Dorcas who said, the following week, that 2 young women from the church had asked about her. One who had recently left a bad situation of her own, one who was trying to figure out if she could. Both of them, Dorcas said, with the careful tone she used when she was not quite asking but was clearly implying, could use some practical guidance from someone who had recently done what they were afraid to do. Lavinia thought about this. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she wrote back and said they were welcome to come on Thursday afternoon. She would have tea ready. 4 women came on Thursday, not 2. Word, it seemed, had moved faster than the invitation. She sat at her aunt's table, which she had already begun to think of as her own table, in the way you begin, slowly, to extend ownership over the things you have been generously given. And she talked about what she knew. Not about law, because she was not a lawyer. Not about courage, because she did not think courage was the right word for what she had done, but about the practical things. Where to put money where it could not be reached. How to document your own work. How to know what you were owed. How to leave a place that belonged to someone else and begin carefully and without rush to build something that belonged to yourself. One of the women cried. Lavinia gave her a handkerchief and did not rush her and did not tell her it would be easy, because it would not be. What did it feel like? One of them asked her. When you walked out. She thought about it honestly. Like finally telling the truth, she said. Not to him. To myself. Winter came, and the stone outbuilding near the creek turned out to be more structurally sound than it had looked in summer. Good Virginia limestone, laid by someone who had known what they were doing. She hired 2 men from the church to repair the roof and build a proper door, and she spent 3 days hauling old debris out of the interior and laying down fresh rushes. And at the end of it she had a space that was 12 feet by 14, solidly built, and entirely hers. She was not sure yet what she would make of the 31 acres. She knew farming, in the way that a minister's daughter, who had grown up watching the church's charity garden, knows farming. She knew enough to understand she needed to know more. But she had the winter to read, and her aunt's library was better than anyone gave it credit for being. And she had already written 2 letters. One to a woman she had met through Mrs. Beckwith, who managed a market garden in the next county, and one to the man who had leased the land for hay, asking whether he would be willing to continue, and whether she could come look at the soil with him in the spring. He wrote back. He said yes to both. She kept the ledger she had started in Berryville. The one she had taken when she left, the household accounts in her own hand. She kept it because it was proof. And then she began a new one, on the first page of a fresh book she had bought at the dry goods store on the day she received her second embroidery payment. At the top of the first page she wrote her name. Not Mrs. Ashford. Her name, her full name, the one that was hers before and would be hers after. Lavinia Whitfield. Below it she wrote the date. Below that she wrote, what I have, what I am building, what I know. The room smelled of pine resin from the fresh door, and cold air from the creek, and something else. Something she identified, after a moment, as the particular smell of new paper and ink and all the blank pages that come after. She closed the book. She looked at the stone walls, and the good new roof, and the light coming through the small window she had already decided to make larger in the spring. She thought, I am 29 years old, and I have 31 acres and a trade, and $43 become something more, and I am exactly at the beginning. And then she opened the book again and she began to write.